It is incredible what you can do with jazz chords. I'm sure you already know that if you're clicking on this video. I'm going to give you an overview of 12 practical and important types of chords that you will come across once you start exploring jazz guitar. I'm going to start with the ones that I think make the most sense for beginners, but also add something that I think is often left out in teaching and understanding jazz chords. I'm going to show you how the different types of chords also fit together, because if you check out how jazz chords are used, then it's rarely just one type of chord used all the time. We mix it up quite a lot, and often that is what makes it sound so great. And having that connection also makes it a lot easier to have an overview and remember all these chords. Shell-voicings. These simple 3-note chords are by far the best place to start, because they're easy to play, easy to hear, they cover all the basic harmony, and as you will see, they're also an amazing foundation to build a lot of other voicing types on. The basic harmony in jazz is built around 7th chords, which is 4-part harmony. But with the Shell-voicings, you get there using just 3 notes instead of 4. So for the C major 7 chord, then you have the chord tones C, E, G, and B. And for the Shell-voicing, we of course leave out the 5th, the G, and then you can play the C either on the 5th string, which gives you this chord, or on the 6th string, which gives you this chord. When it comes to learning new voicings, then there are 2 ways that you want to explore chords if you're trying to get them into your playing. First, take them through the scale. So for the Shell-voicings, that might be this exercise. But you also want to spend some time playing chord progressions so that you can hear what they sound like in music. Let me just reveal right away that most of the chord voicings in this video will actually come from adding or taking away notes from the Shell-voicings. And as you'll see, they are surprisingly important to know. I was actually a bit surprised that there are quite a few of the types of voicings that I'm talking about in the video that are very common, but we don't have a standard name for them. They will pop up a lot quicker than you might think, and feel free to suggest a name in the comments. Less is more. Shell-voicings are a great example of this and how you can get things done with fewer notes and a bit of context. But as we all know, the Swedish guitar wizard says,
"How can less be more? It's impossible. More is more."
So let's start adding some notes to the Shell-voicings, since more is more. The Shell-voicing with the root on the 6th string can have the 5th added to it. You have this, and then of course we're just adding the 5th, and that's on the B string, so that's this note, and then you have this drop 3 voicing. So now you have a way to play all 4 notes again, and we call this a drop 3 voicing because of how it's constructed. I'll explain the drop concept a bit later in the video. Like this, I think it's pretty clear how the Shell-voicings and drop 3 voicings fit very well together, because you can kind of just see them as Shell-voicings with added notes, and that makes it possible to play short riffs mixing the 2. And of course, it's also useful to take these through a scale. Here's an F major scale. With the way Shell-voicings are constructed, then making inversions doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's more common with drop 3 voicings. For the F major 7, you have these 4 inversions. But inversions are still not something that you want to spend too much time on with the drop 3. The root position version is by far the one that's played the most. With later voicings like drop 2, you'll see that inversions become much more useful and therefore also a lot more common. Right now you're only adding a note to one of the Shell-voicing types. Let's look at what happens when you do the same with the other one, which actually gives you extensions. And that creates both some beautiful voicings, but also some problems. Adding these will also give you a way to play some smooth progressions using the drop 3, which isn't really possible right now. The same process of adding a note to the 5th string Shell-voicing will give you this C major 7, 9. Because you're adding a diatonic 9th to the chord, then taking it through the scale will give you some voicings that work really well, and then also a few that you probably won't use that much. As I mentioned, then there's no common name for this chord construction, so I made one up for this video, calling it Shell-Derived. If you have a better suggestion, you can always leave a comment on the video. Together with the drop 3, you can now add more color to the chords in the progression. So perhaps more is more. It is maybe a bit odd to introduce these before I go over sort of the normal drop 2 voicings, but I think it makes a lot more sense in terms of linking the chords and understanding how they're constructed. You start with a shell voicing, let's take this G7, then you add one note to get a drop 3, and if you add one more note on the next string, then you get a drop 2 with a bass note. The advantage here is that you really just learn a shell voicing and then you're adding notes to expand your options in terms of what melodies are available. If you move these to the scale, then you get an exercise, something like this. And of course, some of these are a little bit difficult to play and maybe not that practical, but they still sound great. These can be really amazing for chord melody because they are beautiful, big, full-sounding voicings. But of course, they're also a little bit tricky. To get to the drop 2 voicings and some other very practical types, it's useful to look at the smallest possible jazz voicing, which is sort of the opposite of this. Adding notes obviously make things a bit more complicated, both in terms of technique and having an overview of what notes are played. So this will actually make things easier. When you play in a band, then most of the time somebody else is taking care of the bass line, usually a bass player. And that means that you don't have to play that. And it even might sound better if you get out of the way. Going back to the shell voicings, then this is pretty easy. For the 5th string root, then you have this chord. And of course you're just removing the bass note, so you end up with this. And the same for the 6th string root. This is the shell voicing, and this is the rootless version. With these chords you can easily play progressions, and you're not very likely to clash with the soloist or get in the bass player's way. You can take these to the scale as well, but maybe you can also just think of the shell voicing with the root and then just not play it. Drop 3 voicings without a bass note have their own kind of magic because they become triads. So if you have a C major 7 like this one, and then you remove the root, so the C, then you have this, which is an E minor triad. And this is something that you want to be aware of for other chords as well, because that's very practical. So C major 7, which would be C, E, G, and B. Without the C, that's E, G, B, which is an E minor triad. And in the same way, D minor 7 without the D is an F major triad, and G7 without the G is a B diminished triad. The biggest advantage here is that you can use this with the inversions of the triads as well. So the basic 2-5-1 could be this. And you can turn that into 2 more 2-5-1 progressions using the inversions of these triads. And one of the triads is maybe a little bit mysterious, but I'll explain that afterwards. The one for the G7 with a 9 is in this case an F major flat 5 triad. A major flat 5 triad sometimes cause a bit of discussion in the comments, but that is really the best description of that group of notes. And in this case, also a really good description of the voice leading. You of course have one more inversion. That would be this. The biggest advantage with the triads is that they become something else and are both very flexible and easy to work with for comping and chord solos. A bonus is that they also immediately connect to the next type of voicing. Again, you can lean on adding more notes to the shell voicing and then end up with a drop 2. We start with this G7 2-note shell, then add one more note on the next string, and finally add this one to get a drop 2 voicing. But here it's probably also useful to cover what that drop concept means in voicings, even if that is something you never use when you're playing. I actually never understood why people think that you would use that while you're trying to comp. We're not computers. But of course, that said, it isn't super complicated. If you look at a G7 just in a root position, then you have this. Now constructing a drop 2 is just taking the second highest note, in this case that's the D, and then moving that down an octave, which with a more practical way of playing the notes gives you this voicing for a G7. And in the same way, you could start with the root position and then take the third highest note, which is the B, and then move that down an octave. Then you have this drop 3. Knowing this is nice, but to get anything out of it in your playing, then you need the voicings in your fingers and in your ears. Just knowing is not really knowing, because we don't have time to think about constructing chords while we're playing. I think most people who use them never think about constructing them. They just learn the voicings. Now with drop 2, it's useful to check out how they move through the key. But you should also check out the inversions. And the drop 2 inversions makes it really easy to play chord progressions with smooth movement from chord to chord, like this turnaround. Drop 2 chords are incredibly flexible with what extensions and voicings you can put together, so they're definitely worth the effort to study and way too big to cover in this video in detail, because there are other sounds to explore as well. And now we can let go of the shell voicings. The way you usually construct chords, as you've seen earlier, is by stacking thirds in the scale. So from G, you create a G major triad by adding the B and the D over it. But you could also stack fourth intervals from G. That will give you this 3-note chord, G, C, and F. This is what we call a quartal voicing. With quartal voicings, it becomes a bit more open. You don't always have one chord that spells out the harmony of the song at that point. Instead, you rely on a few to get the sound across. And that's also why I didn't give this chord a name. You fit them onto chords by looking at what notes are in there and how that relates to the chord that's in the song. But it's still useful to take the chords through the scale and get some voicings to work with, even if we don't have specific names for them. And you can put these to use on a 2-5-1 like this, and notice how I rely on using several quartal voicings per chord. The construction of the drop chords, where you move one of the notes down an octave, also works incredibly well for triads and can give you some really beautiful voicings. Let's take a look at an F major triad here. And then I'm taking the middle voice, the A, moving that down an octave to this. And then I'm playing the F in a different place, and then I have this. And you have inversions for spread triads as well. This sounds beautiful if you put it to use on a 2-5-1 like this. And again, we get the bonus of the inversions. And what is great about them is that we can move the different voices in beautiful, simple melodies. Let's look at some beautiful voicings that are the opposite of open. This category of voicings is difficult to describe with just one type of construction, since there are actually a few similar and common examples. I think the important part here is the second interval that's in there, and as you'll see, it's also less important to have complete voicings all the time. One that you want to explore is, maybe surprisingly, the inversion of the shell voicings. So for an F major 7, you have these inversions. And you also want to explore the inversions of the shell voicing that leaves out the third and uses the fifth, because that's also a great candidate. And check out how that sounds if you put it to use on a 2-5-1, combining it with a C major 7 version as well. Now, of course, there are more options for this that you can explore, but I think that's for another video, because there are 2 more types of chords that should be mentioned here as well. Similar to the 3-part Quartal Harmony, you also have 4-part Quartal Voicings, which can sound great even if they are kind of tricky to fit into progressions. First, let's just check out how these chords work through the scale, and notice that, again, I'm not going to give a name to each voicing, because that's not really how you use it with this type of harmony. Check out how these sound really great in a 2-5-1 with an altered dominant in there. Let's look at another beautiful type of drop voicing that has sort of an Alan Holdsworth sound to it. You already know about the drop 2 and drop 3 voicings that I showed you in this video, but a more open version, which also sounds a bit like a colorful version of the spread triads, is drop 2 and 4. You can create these by starting with a C major 7. We need to move down the second and the fourth highest note in this voicing. So of course the second highest is the G, and the fourth highest is actually the lowest, which is the C. So if we take the second highest note first, the drop 2 version of this chord is going to be this one. And then you of course also need to move down the C, so that would be this note that goes down here, and then you have this beautiful sound. Check out how this sounds if you take it through the scale. And you can use them as upper structures as well, which is really where they shine. Check out how this F major 7 to F half diminished to E minor 7 becomes a beautiful 2-5-1 in C major with an altered dominant. Is there a voicing type that I didn't cover in this video that happens to be your favorite? Maybe you play a lot of power chords? Then let me know about that in the comments. I know that Gilad Hexelman uses drop 2 and 3 quite a lot, but as far as I know, that's not super common, so I left that one out. When it comes to playing chords, then there are other things to consider than which voicing to play. You also need to be able to get the rhythms, the phrasing, and the progressions to make sense. And if you want to develop that side of your playing, then the exercises in this video will help you level up your skills. And I know that because that's what I practice.